Chief Economist at Econometrix, Dr. Azar Jammine, and the Oxfam South Africa chairperson and development economist Phelisa Nkomo joining me now just to give me a little bit of their take on the budget. Good afternoon, Ms. Nkomo, and good afternoon, Dr. Jammine. Just first up, an overriding question. I'll begin with you, Azar Jammine. The minister, when he started his budget, he said, and I quote, that we need to strike a critical balance between saving lives and livelihoods, and this budget seeks to strike that balance. Did he? Does the budget do that, in your view?
You know, it's extremely difficult to try and help livelihoods in South Africa in an environment where so many of the youth receive a poor education, come out of school, and are ill-equipped to actually add value to the economy and then can't find a job. But there's also a limit to which any single budget can actually address that. You mentioned money being increased to support education and skills development. That is welcome. But the key is, will that money be directed appropriately and will it be spent efficiently? If it does that, then I'm sure that that this budget will work towards assisting livelihoods. But, you know, the economy has been going downhill for more than a decade, and to think that we can reverse a trend with one budget, I think, is a tall order. I think the most important thing that the minister said right at the start was that we have been helped a lot through a revenue windfall, but the government is clearly not relying on that to continue, and therefore has moved back to budgeting as if it didn't receive such a big windfall, other than possibly granting this extra 44 billion rand for the special social grant. And I think that's the prudent way of doing so, and rather retiring debt with the additional money will have been received from the commodities price boom, and in so doing helping.
And that's where the bulk, that's where the bulk of that extra 180 billion rand is going to. We'll unpack a little bit of those numbers a little bit later. Ms. Phelisa Nkomo, let me bring you up there and give you an opportunity as well for your initial reaction. The minister starting there by saying this budget presents this balance, which he described as a critical balance between saving lives and livelihoods. For you, from your perspective, does this budget do that?
Well, I mean, at face value, Dan, it actually does give a sense that it's actually quite balanced. And you could see, you know, how difficult it was for him to be able
Ms. Nkomo, I'm battling to hear you. You're very soft. Sorry, Ms. Nkomo, I'm battling to hear you. I can hear you speaking, but you're coming across as very, very soft. Maybe you could try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, but you're still very soft. Yes. But keep on going. I'm sure our technical team will sort it out.
Okay, excellent. So I think the point I'm making is that I think at face value, you could tell that this budget is a bit balanced. But I think everything actually, as Azar has mentioned, is at an execution level. Because, I mean, you know, we've been presented with similar budgets before. Several things for me. I mean, I'm concerned about taking the bulk of that windfall to debt servicing, because I think you need that funding for actually channel it to proactive activities so that this country can actually work. I was expecting that the minister, amongst the things he was going to announce, is that it could take some of this money and channel it to rail infrastructure, which is actually falling apart in Gauteng, in the Western Cape, in the Eastern Cape. And that's actually would have been the best public employment program. That's one. I think the second issue is the minister needs to actually express a very similar tough love to municipalities, right? Where municipalities are getting infrastructure grants and channeling it to either office consumables or wages. So we need to see that tough love. And part of that tough love as well has to be about reducing government inefficiencies and repetitions, where, for example, you find that for all three spheres of government, they're actually delivering the same thing. If they have to do housing, they all do this housing. But also you don't see any leveraging either on existing capacity or on existing resources. I think we do welcome, for example, his comment on SMME support. But I must say, though, is that I think the speech of Ralo is so gender neutral because, again, women, bear the brunt of economic exclusion in this country. Data already shows that, in particular, black women actually constitute 55.8% of unemployed. They are, disengage life if they are not in the informal economy. So it is important that there is a very clear concomitant support in the informal sector where women are actually located. I think the spending on infrastructure is actually quite excellent. I think we should welcome that. But I also think that there were other things that the minister should have pronounced very clearly. The youth unemployment, which Azar speaks about. And because the youth unemployment in this country at 77%, indicates social instability. And that's why all of us, we have to have securities around our own houses. But what happens to rural homes like Lugusikisiki, where older women are subjected to gender-based violence and sexual assault by younger men because they don't have security to look after themselves. So it means that that's a group of young people who actually need to have access to opportunities.
Yeah, could Azar, let me bring you in here, could the benefit that's coming to business in terms of the good news of the cut in corporate tax, could it help to spare business, for example, to play its role going forward to create jobs, especially for young people?
Yes, however, it needs to be seen in perspective. I'm very glad that the minister kept his word. This was important. In last year's budget, he promised he would reduce the corporate tax rate. And South Africa's corporate tax rate is amongst one of the higher ones in the world. So this is in the right direction. But, a 1% is welcome, but it's not on its own going to do a huge amount. I think more importantly, it's the signal that it sends to markets that the government is trying at least to be somewhat investor friendly, and that is positive. But on its own, really, it's not a big deal. In fact, what is far more important, if you look at the budgetary forecasts, is that after this huge jump of 57% in corporate tax revenue budgeted for the current fiscal year, the government is then budgeting for a decline of 15.5% in revenue from corporate tax in the forthcoming fiscal year. And this is the elephant in the room that I don't think people fully recognize and is actually beyond the scope of the minister himself. He's got no control over it. And that is to try and predict what commodity prices are going to do in the coming year. Ironically, even in the face of signs that the world economy may slow down a lot, commodity prices have revived since the end of last year and are probably, we're going to probably do a lot better still over and above what he has budgeted for in the short term. The difficulty is how long can he rely on that? On the positive side, we could have an upside surprise in the coming year.
Yeah. The extension of the social distress grant, I think, has been received positively. It was expected after the President's State of the Nation address, but still no word about the basic income grant. Phelisa, what's your view?
Well, I think for me, it's something that we welcome, the 350 extension. But we know that there's very little that any family, even an individual, can do with 350 rands. So that means that the promise that the president made in his State of the Nation address, that they're looking at social security package to support South African, it's something that we actually, really look forward to. And we're hoping that there's going to be very clear proposals. Perhaps the other thing I should also welcome from the minister's speech is the proposal or reforms for the financial sector in relation to pension funds. But I'm worried about the type of power he's giving to trustees, that the trustees should actually make the decision on whether, how much should the access to pension fund be, or whether individuals who've been paying pension funds for over a period of time should be, because they're likely to be in a position where their houses could be repossessed and they are not able to take their children to schools. And in essence, they would be still sitting with millions in a form of pensions. So I think that relief is welcomed, but I do think that the administrative components, I think the National Treasury must take some form of responsibility of oversight within that process, because that process also contributes fundamentally to demand issues in South Africa, which currently have a problem with, but also it provides safety nets to households who under normal circumstances would not have income. One of the things that the minister should call on is that the pension fund should invest in financial literacy and financial advisories to the people who would be qualifying for certain access in terms of their pension funds. And I hope that that access to the pension funds is not going to, only take place in 18 months. Families are actually under pressure now, and they do need, that kind of resources. So that's something that I think we should actually welcome from the speech. I mean, it would have been great for Minister as well to talk about gender-based violence. I mean, gender-based violence is a huge issue, and that's why, as women in this country, we've been calling for gender budgeting, that women must be at the center of resource allocation. We should not be in the periphery. So, for instance, amongst those is this 15 billion. I think the funding is actually welcomed because it contributes to structural issues around access to finance and the fact that they are lessening or loosening up or relaxing, the rules in terms of accessing that finance.
Yeah,
but the administrative component, it often is quite exclusionary. And National Treasury must pay attention to that, because DFIs have actually been excluding a lot of women to access finance.
Yeah, and hopefully a bulk of that 8.7 billion rand for the police, for example, will be used towards tackling gender-based violence cases. Let me bring in Sizwe Pamla from Cosatu. Sizwe, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. It's Dan here. Your overriding reaction to the budget speech. The minister started by saying it has to strike a balance, as he said, in terms of livelihoods as well, and highlighting that the recovery in the country currently, economic recovery, is still uneven and risks remain. What's your view, Sizwe?
Well, it's nothing we have not heard before. If you read the budget of the last 3 years, it's a repetition of the similar things. Minister seems to believe that the policies that have been there for a decade, they are good enough. Maybe the problem is they have not been properly implemented. For an example, we talk about this cut in corporate debt, 1% cut. If you go back to 2012, when the NDP was introduced, corporate tax was 34%. Gradually, it has been cut, with the hope that jobs will be produced for some reason. Now, here's a problem with that. 7% later, there are no jobs. Conversation we hear from the private sector, they are not hiding this. They are mechanizing. 2017 mining in Durban, Cape Town, the mining sector meets, it says the future of mining in South Africa is for us to follow the Chilean and Canadian model of mining, which is mechanization. Now, you hand over these tax incentives, good and well, but then the private sector comes back and says, we actually intend on destroying the existing jobs. And you ignore that. You pretend as if this is not happening. The auto sector, the president 2 years ago, he comes out in his State of the Nation address, very excitedly says, Ford is investing 15 billion in his plant in Pretoria. People get excited. Then they realize later that actually a bulk of that investment is going to be invested in robotics, because Ford USA had felt that Ford South Africa was low in mechanization. So no one is talking about the fact that a bulk of the money that is being given to the private sector is actually being used to destroy existing jobs. So that's why we're saying nothing we haven't had before. Like I said, the NDP, when it was introduced 12 years ago, it said exactly what the budget was saying today. So as far as we are concerned, you can look at the SOEs.
Yeah,
there's allocation of the money. We welcome.
Yeah, on the SOEs, the minister spoke about tough love, and he spoke about Eskom, and he spoke about the issue of the debt, but he said there's not going to be any money just given anyhow. I don't think even SAA will be getting any money. So it looks like it's moving in the right direction when you look at it like that. But what do you think, Sizwe?
Well, it depends what you regard as the right direction. So if all of the SOEs fail to pay workers and they fail to pay service providers who happens to employ workers, if that is your right direction, then we can't dispute that. The reality is the money that is there, that is being handed over to these SOEs, is actually going straight to servicing debt. It isn't really about fixing them. The idea of these SOEs was that you need to develop a funding model. You need to talk about whether some of them have to be matched. You need to talk about the developmental, the business model of these SOEs. We had an SOE council appointed almost a year ago now. It's like they haven't met. There's nothing that is being said in SONA. There's nothing that is being said in this budget. And yet we keep pretending as if this is not a problem. The minister tells us the problems of the municipality. Read the Auditor General's report of the last 5 years. There's nothing new in what he said. All you have to do is to read an annual Auditor General's report. It will tell you what he was telling us. The question is, when he was putting together that budget, after reading the Auditor General's report of last year at least, what is it that he can say I'm presenting as an intervention? Let's look at the Zondo Commission, fight against corruption. The Auditor General tells us 10% of our budget is lost to corruption and wasteful expenditure. Now, the Zondo Commission directs us as to where did some of these leakages come from. Where are the interventions and the solutions? Zondo Commission took 2 years.
Do you think,
the government was there? Now they're asking for another 6 months to read the report.
Yeah,
and now we're supposed to say.
Sorry, Susan, to cut in. I want to bring in Ms. Nkomo and Azar Jammine to the two other guests, and we don't have much time. Do you think there should have been more clarity, Ms. Nkomo, around the Zondo Commission in terms of this budget, more than what the minister has put out today?
Well, yes, I think so, because part of it is the commitment of the president, actually from last year, that one of the key issues is issues around dealing with corruption. Now, we know that corruption is an economic leakage. So if, for instance, we lose 10% of our budget, towards corruption, so the minister should have actually been much more explicit about what are the different things is the Treasury going to be doing to ensure that they actually deal with. I mean, look, I know that he actually cited one of the culprits and the Shiza, etc. But the real is that we need something that is much more concrete. Something else which I think the minister has highlighted is the public sector summit. I do think that there needs to be, and I'm pleased that Mr. Pamela from Cosatu is here, because one of the key things we need to really get into a conversation is the quality of public service that the citizens get within this country, who most of them are members of Cosatu, and I really respect that they have a right to be members of the trade union. But the quality of service citizens receive at municipality level, where there's no collection of garbage, but also at the same time, when you look at the type of wages that people get to earn while they're under servicing the community. So, as Oxfam and civil society organization, we would really like to participate in that public service summit, because we think that we need a new social compact between citizens, government, and as well as the workers in as far as the quality of service, and not rely on performance agreements that get signed between a worker and management, because I do think that they remain part of the critical partner.
Yeah,
last issues around the structural transformation. I like the fact that the minister had actually said that that's something that we're focusing in. But the structural transformation has just been on the agenda for the last 5 years. We need to know at a micro level, sectoral level, what are the type of structural transformation propositions that are coming out. One, the access to finance is one issue. The Competition Commission has issued a report where it shows the oligopolistic nature of our economy and monopolistic nature, and it's government who actually support such behaviors in the market.
Just to go back, sorry, Ms. Nkomo, just to go back to the state capture thing and the Zondo. Azar, let me bring you in here. The minister did refer to it, but he specifically was talking about the need to improve state capability and reduce the scope of procurement corruption. I mean, that loss of 10% of revenue in terms of corruption that CISO is talking about is largely been coming through that procurement thing. Was that enough? Does it give you comfort that the government will deal with procurement corruption to save that money?
That is the real problem with both the budget speech and the State of the Nation address. But one has to bear in mind that, they also have a limited amount of time in which to deliver these addresses. In fact, Minister Godongwana's address this time was actually shorter than some of them have been more recently, and some will welcome that. But it doesn't leave you much time to actually give more detail. The problem with that is that people will be suspicious about there not being more detail and will question the credibility of the commitments to fight corruption, and the same way as President Ramaphosa spoke about it. And the big question is, yes, but will we see this being implemented in practice? And that is, I think, the big question mark that will be surround this budget is, are we going to see implementation? The same thing with the various infrastructural investment commitments. Yes, he mentioned a couple, the Umzumvubu Dam and one or other, but really that wasn't very comprehensive. I've been looking through the budget review also to try and see if there's more meat to it, and it's not readily available. And so that is what I think people are going to take out of this. And I tend to share the misgivings about, yes, we've heard about the commitment, but shouldn't there have been more? Well, it would have taken a long time to go through everything in a lot of detail, but then again, there's a big question mark. We haven't seen the implementation and faster bringing to book of people for corruption, and is this going to be any different this time?
Yeah, just using the basic income grant as a matter, and Sizwe, I'll get your view here. In an interview just a short while ago between my colleague Devin Murugan and the minister himself, Inoku Dongwana, he said between now and October, there's going to be consultations around all kinds of grants, because there's the clamor for a universal basic income grant is growing in the country. And he didn't say that in the budget speech, but he was explaining it now in an interview. Your views around how that is being approached. For instance, the basic income grant, you've got such high unemployment in the country, the poverty levels are rising. Sizwe?
Well, we've been having this conversation about consultations. If there's one thing that this administration, at least, we can give credit to, is because it consults. The problem, those consultations hardly ever help. Just to go back, I'm going to answer your question, but just to go back to one of your guests who was talking about the Public Service Summit. We have had a number of summits, in fact, and the issue is not summits. The issue is implementation. On the public service, for an example, you don't even need a summit. All you need to check is a teacher-to-student ratio, it's a nurse-to-patient ratio, and the doctor-to-patient ratio, the police-to-citizen ratio. If you can start there, you can resolve half of the problems that you will be discussing in a summit. On the basic income grant, well, look, there is a fear to commit to the basic income grant, despite the fact that the literature of the ANC is littered with the commitment. The manifesto itself has made a commitment to the people of South Africa. The issue of the basic income grant is the best way to avoid spending so much money on social welfare is to let people look after themselves. You give them jobs and then you don't have to look after them. That's the only way to reduce the amount of money you spend on the basic income grant. But what you can't do is to keep handing over incentives to the private sector that doesn't give you anything in return. And you put the private sector in a corporate welfare arrangement. And then you look at the people that you have betrayed through your policy choices, and you say you don't have enough resources. If you cut corporate tax and no jobs are created in a year's time, what are those young people seated at home supposed to think? Because they are seated at home, they watch their dreams pass them by. You have betrayed them with your policy choices. Yet your private sector is on welfare. You give them the youth wage subsidy, youth employment scheme, corporate tax cards, and yet when you talk about the basic income grant, you start to be aware of the unaffordability.
Yeah, Sizwe, I need to cut in there. Sorry, Sizwe. No. Yeah, I need to cut in there. Your line is not the best line, and you're making some valid points, but we're also running out of time. I want to give you, each of you, the last word very quickly. Sizwe, you joined us. We had started to get a sense from the other two guests about their overall view of the budget. They gave me that sense. Just as we conclude, each of you, in 30 seconds for each, the biggest hit and the biggest miss, what was right with the budget? Sizwe, you've said we've had it before. So for you, there's not much really, but was there anything at all? So very briefly, what was the biggest hit and the biggest miss for each of you? Sizwe first.
Well, we do appreciate that some of the commitments from the SONA were honored. Of course, we don't want to leave the poor hungry. Of course, this is not enough, but it is something. We appreciate the tone of the minister. We have long said that we can have a conversation, but the kind of arrogance that comes from a person who's responsible for a department that mismanages our economy matters. Allowing negotiations to take place at the PSCPC is a big deal for workers. We'll engage on that. And we do appreciate that in some areas where the president did make commitments, the minister did actually honor some of those commitments. But generally speaking, this is not a budget that should come from a government with 46% real unemployment, with 15 million people struggling to have 3 meals a day.
Okay, Sizwe, thank you. Azar?
I think the biggest hit with respect is the fact that the minister did commit himself to being cautious about the potential downside risks that could emanate, certainly in the commodity market, so that the government might end up with a lot lower revenue than could have been the case. I think he was right to be cautious, and I think that will be welcomed by the markets. And what is so essential about being welcomed by the markets, that will help to suppress the level of long-term interest rates, which are exorbitantly high, but at least they won't go still higher. And that will limit the amount that the government has to spend more on servicing its debt. The big miss is, I think, what I spoke about a few minutes ago is, people are still going to ask, it's all very well to talk about structural reforms. It's all very well to say that we are hoping for a growth rate in excess of 2% per annum. We're not budgeting for anything lower than that. But the proof of the pudding is in the implementation. And there was not enough in the budget to actually make one recognize that that this time it will be different. Having said that, of course, there's a limit to what the government can actually include in a budget without it being extraordinarily long.
Okay, thank you very much. Phelisa, finally, you have a final word?
Yes, I think the minister's budget was really about calming the waters, which I think he's achieved. That's why he's getting a lot of positive reviews. I think the biggest miss for me is funding for industrial development, because I think he needs to be quite explicit. I think the point that Sizwe is making is that if you grant South Africans opportunities or access to decent jobs with decent wages, have to draw a single social security grant. So as long as citizens are not granted that, certainly they're going to have to come back into the public purse. I think the minister needs to articulate very clearly what are the structural transformation issues is he referring to. What should we be expecting? I agree with you around the corruption issue. I think the corruption, it was just a scratch on the surface. We need much more details. I think that as well, municipalities, the mismanagement of public resources at municipal level and provincial government, it's one area where National Treasury needs to pay attention.
Thank you very much. That is Phelisa Nkomo. She's chairman of Oxfam SA and a development economist. Azar Jammine, economist from Econometrix, and Sizwe Pamla on behalf of Trade Union Federation Cosatu. Your views and insights post the delivery of Budget 2022 by Minister Enoch Gondongwana. We're having a mixed bag, largely positive. As Phelisa Nkomo said there, I like it. He managed to calm the waters, but there's still some detail that is needed. And still ahead, we're going to hear shortly from Xhanti Payi from the Black Business Council.